As a kid, I struggled with nightmares almost every night. Shadows took on strange shapes, and every creak of the house felt like something sinister lurking in the dark. Because of that, I often found myself tiptoeing to my parents' room, seeking the safety of their presence. But the worst part wasn't the nightmares, it was the doll. It was an old porcelain doll, a family hand-me-down that looked innocent enough during the day, but took on a strange, lifelike quality at night. It sat on my dresser, propped up by pillows, its painted eyes staring straight ahead. My mom loved it and said it had character, but to me it was always unsettling, especially in the dark. One night I was alone in my room, trying to be brave and stay in bed without bothering my parents. The doll was sitting next to me, and I was playing with its tiny lace dress, talking to it to keep the silence away. That's when I felt it, a sudden chill that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I glanced toward the window, thinking maybe it was just the breeze, but then I froze. Outside, standing just beyond the glass, was a girl. She looked almost my age, with pale skin and long blonde hair. She was staring directly at me, a small smile on her face. Before I could move, she started to giggle, a soft, eerie sound that seemed to carry through the glass. Her laughter echoed, filling the quiet room. My chest tightened as fear clawed at me. I blinked, and just like that, she was gone. I whipped around, and my gaze landed on the doll, its painted eyes looking straight ahead, unblinking, unchanging. But for a moment, I could have sworn it was looking at me. Without a second thought, I grabbed the doll, tossed it across the room, and ran to my parents' room. I curled up between them, my heart still racing, telling myself it was just my imagination. I never went back to sleeping alone in my room after that, and I made sure that the doll stayed far, far away, stored in the attic. When I was 15, we lived in a quiet, remote town, in an old house on the edge of a forest. The kind of place where everything seems to go quiet at night, with only the wind rustling the trees. That night, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when a sudden, loud bang shook my bedroom door. I shot up, my heart pounding, straining my ears in the dark. The noise had been so loud, it was impossible to ignore. I waited, listening for any movement outside my room. The house was silent, though, a heavy, unnerving silence. Just as I was about to brush it off as my imagination, I heard it again. Bang! This time it was followed by what sounded like footsteps, slow and heavy, moving just outside my door. My skin prickled with fear, and I felt frozen, not daring to move a muscle. I figured it had to be my parents, maybe one of them up for water, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then I heard it. A scream, distant but unmistakable. A woman's voice, high-pitched and desperate, echoing from somewhere outside, carrying through the still night air. I scrambled out of bed and crept to my door, listening as the scream seemed to rise, then fade, like it was coming from the forest just beyond our backyard. I opened my door and tiptoed down the hall, hoping my parents had heard the same noises and were checking things out. But when I reached their room, I found them both sound asleep, undisturbed by any of the sounds that had jolted me awake. I whispered, called out to them, but they didn't stir, as if nothing at all had happened. I went back to my room, locking the door behind me, and lay awake for hours. Every sound amplified, every shadow a potential threat. By morning, the house felt as normal as ever, my parents completely unaware of the terror I'd experienced. But I never did sleep peacefully in that house again, always waiting for the next bang in the night. When my uncle was 10, he lived in a small village where odd stories seemed to drift in with the wind. The kind of stories adults dismissed, but kids traded with wide-eyed wonder. One night, his usually quiet neighbor began acting completely out of character, screaming, laughing, pacing erratically in his yard. This went on for hours, loud enough that the whole neighborhood could hear. His family tried everything to calm him, but nothing worked. Soon, people from nearby homes gathered, whispering in concern. Desperate, the family called the village priest, who arrived with a serious, almost wary expression. He observed the neighbor for a long moment, then asked the family if they'd recently brought anything unusual into the house. After a moment's hesitation, they admitted to finding an odd, dusty old bottle under a tree on the outskirts of the village. They'd brought it home as a curiosity and set it in the entryway. The priest's face grew grave as he asked to see the bottle. When it was brought to him, he turned it in his hands, studying it intently. He muttered something under his breath, then instructed the family to follow him outside. He led them to the edge of the village, where the bottle had originally been found, and there, under the same old tree, he dug a small hole and buried it back into the earth, saying a few quiet words as he covered it with soil. Just as they finished, the laughter and screaming from the house fell silent. The neighbor, once loud and frenzied, had suddenly grown calm. When the family returned, they found him sitting quietly, looking around in confusion. He had no memory of his outburst, no idea why people had gathered outside his home. To him, the night had been perfectly ordinary. After that night, the old bottle was never seen again. The village quickly returned to normal, and the incident became one of those whispered stories, half remembered, that kids would tell each other